Welcome to EPG Pathasala. This is the course in public policy. The module we are going to discuss is on approaches to the study of public policy. Theoreticians of public policy simultaneously use the word model and also approaches there. We thought that approach may be better in this context there. So this module is organized into three parts. Part 1 examines the need for approaches. Part 2 gives an analysis of each model or the salient features of each model. And the last part gives a kind of a conclusion. It is difficult to do justice to all approaches there. So we have selected 3 approaches here. These include what is called the group approach, the rational choice model, and the third one is interest-based model. After the group approach and the incremental, the rational approach is the most important 3. There are also other approaches there, like for instance the institutionalist approach there, the institutionalism. What it says? It says that all policy making is by the government. Therefore, study of government and its institutions explains how policies are made. Therefore, critical study of institutions will itself be regarded as an approach there. Then you have other important models which are elitist approach there. There is an assumption that any policy making in countries like India is generally by group of elites there. By the way, what do you mean by elites? Elites are those sections of the people or individuals who are closer to the power structure but are not in the power as such there. So many people influence the course of the policy, the nature of the policy, or the very policy. So study of the role of elites itself is an approach to understanding the policies or how policies are made. Therefore, this module gives you an idea about major approaches, limitations in these approaches, and how policies in general are made by groups, or how incrementalist paradigm can be an important tool to analyze policies, or how rational choice model is the most important way of analyzing public policies there. At the end of the module, you will appreciate these main approaches in addition to appreciating what are the major limitations to each of these policies or policy approaches there, or studying policies based on these 3 significant approaches as such there. Let us begin this way. Public policy, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially intended for protection of public interest. Policy process is a long and comprehensive process, and it passes through a number of stages. Policy process begins with identification of problems and issues for policies and continues till assessment of their outcomes and impact. It is important to study approaches of policy as they provide quick and efficient means of collecting, arranging, evaluating, and drawing out meaning from data in a sophisticated way. They give a kind of an order for a wide range of political phenomena by fitting them in a limited set of concepts. Study of public policy, therefore, is important, and we must recognize that public policy is relatively a new field of inquiry within the domain of political science, public administration. It involves multidisciplinary perspectives and also has an applied dimension. According to Dunn, policy analysis is an applied social science discipline which uses multidisciplinary methods of inquiry and arguments to produce and transform policy relevant information that is useful for political establishments to resolve several of societal problems. A number of authors have categorized policy analysis into three approaches there. Particularly Michael Kraft and Furlong have categorized policy analysis into three major approaches: scientific, professional, and political. The objective of scientific, professional, and political approaches are to search for truth and build theory about policy actions and effects, analyze policy alternatives for solving problems that are faced by people, and they advocate and support preferred policies. As I told you, selected approaches to the public policy include group approach, then rational choice approach, and the third most important objective of study is policy networks approach there. So these three approaches are relevant for us to appreciate the major contributions of several theoreticians of public policy into the policy aspects as such there. Then let us start with group approach. Group approach or group theoretical approach seeks to explain political behavior largely through the study of nature and interaction of social and political groups. It presupposes that the cardinal feature of political life is the interaction and struggle among diverse societal groups. Truman, in his book The Government Processes, 1951, described an interest group as a shared attitude group that makes certain claims upon other groups in society, and it becomes political when it makes a claim through or upon the institutions of government. The fundamental nature of politics is the controversy and conflict derived from the activities of different and conflicting groups many times. Public policy is a result of negotiations, bargaining, and compromises resulting from competition between diverse groups. Individuals with common and shared interests demands from groups to strengthen their support. Group interventions involve building coalitions or forming political action committees. The groups pressurize government to formulate and implement those policies that favor their goals and suit their ends. The mission of political system is to manage group struggle by laying down rules of the game, arranging compromises, and balancing interests, making compromises in the form of public policy and enforcing them. Public policies are formulated on the basis of adjustment and equilibrium reached at in the struggle of various groups engaged in this process. The struggle maintains equilibrium in the system in the end. At least that's what the expectation is. Various groups keep a check on each other's activities, due to which no group becomes enormously powerful at the expense of others. In a system for all times, in the ongoing process of struggle, groups gain and lose power and influence. At any point of time, the interests and demands of dominant groups are revealed in public policy or reflected in policy as such there. Then what is rational choice approach? The second most important approach that we wish to apprise you is rational choice approach. Rationality in policy making is considered as a benchmark of wisdom. Rational policy making involves choosing one best policy alternative from several alternatives on rational grounds. Rational choice approach is an efficiency maximization approach, and it proposes calculation of policy efficiency on the basis of all social, economic, and political values achieved and or sacrificed by the adjudication of policy. In framing a policy, all pertinent values have to be precisely considered. The champions of rational approach are Robert Havemann, Thomas Dye, Hebert Simon. Havemann, a professor emeritus of public affairs and economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, views that a rational policy is one which is designed to maximize net value achievement. Thomas R. Dye, professor emeritus of political science at Florida State University, has equated rationality with efficiency. For him, a policy is rational when it is most efficient, that is, if ratio between values it achieves and the values it sacrifices is positive and higher than any other policy alternative. Hebert Simon, a Nobel laureate, an American political scientist, professor at Carnegie Mellon University, in his famous work, Administrative Behavior, studied decision-making processes in organizations, described rationality as one which is concerned with selection of preferred behavior alternatives in terms of some systems of values whereby consequences of behavior can be evaluated. He disregards the concept of total rationality in administrative behavior. Human behavior is neither totally rational nor totally irrational or non-rational. Rather, it involves bounded rationality. In a rational decision-making process, policymakers do not get after any ideal decision as such there. They break the complex issues involved in problems into small and understandable units, opt for one option that can be regarded as satisfactory and avoid unnecessary uncertainty by doing so. He notes that although individuals are by intention rational, their rationality is bounded by limited capacities of cognition in emotions. Further, this is limited also by time and resources. The human being who is making efforts for rationality and is constrained within the bounds of his knowledge developed some working procedures that enable them to partially overcome these difficulties. These procedures involve the assumption that he can isolate from the rest of the world into a closed system which contains limited number of variables and limited range of consequences or options. Simon, in his work The New Science of Management Decision, earlier in 1960, mentioned the three kinds of activities involved in a rational policy making process. These are intelligence activity, design activity, and choice activity. The first phase of decision making process is searching the environment for conditions calling for decision. The second one involves inventing, developing, and analyzing possible courses of action. And the third one consists of selecting a particular course of action from those available. Now, what are the stages in the rational policy making? It involves 5 stages. These include identification of a problem, formulation and setting of goals or priorities, identification a range of policy alternatives, cost-benefit analysis of policy alternatives, selection of most efficient policy alternative. Once the rational policy is formulated, it enters the implementation phase. The implementation of policy is systematically monitored to find out the accuracy of estimates and expectations. On the basis of feedback obtained, policymaker may modify the policy or give it up altogether there. If the feedback is used to monitor and accustom policy, the policy system tends to become self-correcting or cybernetic. Even though rational choice approach is regarded as a logical and scientific one, there are many barriers for achieving rationality in policy making. Some of these include difficulty in accomplishing goals, as rational policy making turns out to be a mere exercise. Maximization of net goal achievement is missing. Conflict between rational choice and the need for action. Dilemma of political feasibility, inaccurate calculation of cost-benefit ratios, and limited capacity of bureaucracy to frame rational policies as such there. Now, the third model that we have selected for discussion today is the incrementalist approach. Incrementalist approach of the policy is associated with Charles Lindblom's sterling work, a professor of emeritus at Yale University. He developed an alternative to the rational model of decision making. His views appeared in very interesting article entitled The Science of Muddling Through, published long back in late 50s in Public Administration Review Journal of American Society. He rejects the idea that decision making is something about defining goals and selecting and comparing alternatives. For him, rational decision making is not workable for complex policy questions, as there are constraints of time, intelligence, cost, and politics, which prevent policymakers from identifying the full range of policy alternatives and their consequences. Therefore, he proposed successive limited comparisons, which he regards as more pertinent and realistic in conditions called bounded rationality. On the basis of his wide-ranging studies on welfare policies and trade unions in the industrialized world, Lindblom proposed that under most circumstances, policy change is evolutionary, not revolutionary. The incremental approach, or a branch approach of decision making, involves a process of continuously building out from the current situation, step by step and by small degrees. This approach points out the real-life constraints on public administration, such as cost, information, time, and politics. According to Lindblom, the prescribed functions and constraints of public administrators restrict their attention to relatively few values and alternative policies. Democracies change their policy priorities almost entirely through incremental adjustment. Policy does not move in leaps and bounds. Policy making involves marginal and uncoordinated estimates in conditions of inconsistent demands and interest, and in the fear of unforeseen consequences that might emerge from actual division. You must have noticed during your studentship or later that several of the poverty elimination programs change their names, not because there is no radical thinking behind them, but the limitations that govern the policy process as such there. The key features of incremental decision making are succession of incremental change, mutual adjustment and negotiation, and trial and error learning. Charles Lindblom and Weybrook, in their work A Strategy of Decision Policy Evaluation as a Social Process, subsequently in 60s introduced the idea of disjointed incrementalism. They regarded disjointed incrementalism as a method of decision making in which comparisons take place between policies which are only marginally different from one another, in which there is no great goal or vision to be achieved there. Objectives are set in terms of existing resources, and policy making takes place by a trial and error method. Again, in the well-known work Intelligence Democracy, Decision Making Through Mutual Adjustment, Lindblom argues that decision making is a process of adjustment and compromise which facilitates agreements and coordination. Martin Reen, in his work Social Science and Public Policy in 70s, commented, the concept of political feasibility is often closely associated with an idea of incremental change. The theory of disjointed incrementalism holds that in the end, muddling and compromise are the only rational approaches to the management and conflicting multiple and ambiguous goals. The incrementalists see resistance to change not as stupidity but as muffled rationality, which is the outcome of political bargaining. For example, policies relating to education over a period of time, you must have seen that the 1968 policy on education, 1977 draft national policy on education, 1986 new policy on education, 1992 revised national policy on education. So also the proposed now 2015-2016 national policy on education again are pointers to the incrementalist paradigm that generally or broadly guides our policymakers in opting for change in an incrementalist fashion. So also the health sector, so also the other sectors. You will be noticing that change comes very gradually and in a very informal. Change comes not in a revolutionary way but in a gradual way, which calls for a deeper analysis into the circumstances in which policy always prefer an incrementalist paradigm. Lindblom, along with Dahl, a supporter of the polyarchy and pluralistic view of political elites and governance, and specialized elites compete and bargain with one another for control. The competition and compromise between elites drive free market democracy and enable it to thrive. These are broadly that fit into the elitist approach to analyzing the policy processes. But soon they are aware of the limitations of polyarchy, especially in a democratic governance. The polyarchy can be easily converted into corporatism when certain groups of elites become highly successful and begin collusion with one another there. In his work, Politics and Markets, in late 70s, Lindblom notes the privileged positions of business in polyarchy and introduces the concept of circularity or controlled volitions there. Same is the case with Kochanak and others who have written extensively on the role of business in politics there, how they influence the policy making. Even in democracies, masses are persuaded to ask from elites only what later wishes to give former. In this manner, in real life, choices and competition are limited. Development of alternative choices and serious discussion on them are generally discouraged. This is what the impression one gets looking at the functioning of democracies across the world. In his later work, The Market System, what it is, how it works, and what to make of it, he has elaborated several concerns raised in his first work, Politics and Markets, and subsequently in the form of new works in the early 2001. The subsequent article, Still Muddling, Not Yet Through, published in Public Administration Review, published in the late 70s again, we are making a comparison. Lindblom makes clear that the central idea in an incrementalist approach is the belief in skill in solving complex problems, and he intends to suggest new and improved ways of muddling through. He makes a distinction between incrementalism as a political pattern with step-by-step changes and incrementalism as policy analysis. Analytical incrementalism is a mode for securing the balance of power in a pluralist society in which business and large corporations have tremendous influence over policy-making processes in various democracies. He mentions three forms of incremental analysis: simple incremental analysis, strategic analysis, and disjointed incrementalism. In the early 90s, particularly 1993, Lindblom, along with Woodhouse, in their joint work, The Policymaking Process, challenged the assumption that political elites and policy analysis professionals hold the keys to improve social problem solving capacities. They argue that policy evolves through complex and reciprocal relations among all bureaucrats, elected functionaries, representatives of interest groups, and other participants. Incrementalism is criticized on the ground that the governments are encountering serious and critical problems, and mere incremental changes in the policy making are not going to solve them. Amitai Edgioni, an Israeli-American sociologist, and Ezekiel Dror, a professor of political science at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, do not agree that the incrementalist approach is a realistic and suitable normative account of decision making. Edgioni particularly regards that models based on pluralist decision making are biased due to pre-existing imbalances in power of participating interests and individuals. Drewer, in his work Public Policy Re-examined, said that a sudden transformation of policy-making system is not possible. Improving policy-making must be a continuing endeavor requiring sustained efforts over a period. The most harmful effect of incremental change, the argument relating to is that it paralyzes efforts and thus tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there is no incentive for innovative policy as such there. Granting that there are difficulties that exist, what we need today is stronger effort to overcome issues involved in this. The difficulties are the problems faced by public policy making establishment is to even make improvements in many policies is necessary, and the knowledge we are now developing makes such improvements possible. We must therefore mobilize energy needed to carry out these difficulties there. Now, the third approach we have selected for discussion today is policy networks approach there. Modern democratic governance makes use of policy networks to make public policies in specific context, especially after liberalization, privatization, globalization, and recognizing governance, which has three dimensions there, that it is not only the government but also non-state actors and also the business there. So the range of different actors who are linked together in political, social and cultural aspects are involved in policy formulation there. The term policy network connotes a cluster of actors, each of whom has an interest or stake in a given policy sector and capacity to help in determining a policy success or failure there. Policy outcomes are often explained by analysts of modern governance by considering the way the networks are structured in a particular sector. The three basic assumptions of policy network include modern governance, that it is frequently non-hierarchical, that means that to say it is not vertical but it is now more horizontal. Few policy solutions are simply imposed by public authorities. Governance involves mutually and interdependence between public and non-public actors there, as well as between different kinds of public actors. Then secondly, the policy process must be disaggregated to be understood because relationship between groups and government vary between policy areas there. For instance, the number of initiatives taken by Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan on the right to information are a pointer in this direction. Governments remain ultimately responsible for governance, but that is not the whole story. Before policies are set by elected political actors, policy choices are shaped and refined in bargaining between diverse range of actors, including some who are non-governmental, all of whom have an interest with what policy is chosen there. Then secondly, the policy process must be disaggregated to be understood because relationship between groups and government vary between policy areas there. For instance, the number of initiatives taken by Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan on the right to information are a pointer in this direction. Governments remain ultimately responsible for governance, but that is not the whole story. Before policies are set by elected political actors, policy choices are shaped and refined in bargaining between diverse range of actors, including some who are non-governmental, all of whom have an interest with what policy is chosen there. Rhodes, a professor of political science, is a pioneer in analyzing policy networks in British government. The term policy networks refers to sets of formal, informal, institutional linkages between government and other actors structured around shared interests in public policy making and implementation. These are interdependent. Policies emerge from the bargaining between these network members. The internal structure of policy networks is usually considered an independent variable there. Marsh and Smith, understanding policy networks towards a dialectical approach, have also developed a new model for explaining policy networks there. So far we have discussed what are the salient features of the three approaches. One is the group approach, the second one is the rational approach, the third one is incrementalist approach, apart from that, we also touched the institutional approach, the elite approach, and also the game theory, many people say, is important area where we need to focus on how policy making can be analyzed there. What is that to see? We have so far discussed that these three significant approaches or models tell us how policy making is done. One, that any policy is an outcome of competition between competing groups there in order to achieve a policy goal. So, as there are more and more competing groups in a polity, the objective is to look up for a policy which satisfies different groups there. Finally, such policies evolved through the prism of group approach which satisfy most of the groups there. That is where group approach tells us. What is the second approach? Second approach, the rational approach, tells us that all policy making has to be rational, and rationality depends not on pure rationality approach as proposed by Lindblom and others. It is bounded rationality. That any rationality, any rational approach tells us that, say, in order to choose the best, you need to examine all the alternatives there. What is bounded rationality? On a particular situation, on a particular day of policy making there, whatever information is available and the logistics that are there condition the policy making. Therefore, rational policy making also has certain limitations there. What is the third approach? The incrementalist approach tells us that, say, in most democracies, radical change in policy making is not possible. It is only adjustment there. It is only evolutionary approach that guides public policies, but not revolutionary approach there. So, these approaches give us a rich perspective in order to analyze public policies there. These three approaches are not standalone approaches, but a combination of these three approaches explains emergence of public policies in majority of the democracies there. But studying public policy in a democracy is a challenge. I hope you have been benefited by this kind of an analysis. Look up for much more interesting module next. Thank you.